Veiled Queens. Everyone remembers the Gilded Age as a time of beauty. Silk dresses, polished manners, quiet rooms filled with candlelight. An era when people seemed refined, composed, almost effortlessly elegant. But here is the question history rarely asks. What if that elegance was not a luxury, but a form of obedience? What if the calm faces, the perfect posture, the immaculate clothing were not signs of freedom, but proof that power had learned how to control without raising its voice? Because in this era, nothing about elegance was accidental, and nothing about it was optional. Before we go any further, take a moment with me. Where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? If you're drawn to the hidden structures of power, the silences history chose to keep, and the rules that shaped women's lives without ever being written down, please like this video and subscribe to Veiled Queens. This channel exists for those who understand that history is not only what was recorded, but what was enforced quietly every single day. Now, let us begin. During the Gilded Age, elegance was not an aesthetic preference. It was not a matter of personal taste, creativity, or self-expression. It was a requirement, one as binding and unforgiving as any written law. To appear elegant was to demonstrate obedience to a social order that valued control over comfort, conformity over authenticity, and visibility over freedom. Elegance functioned as a social passport. Without it, one could not enter the rooms where decisions were made, alliances were formed, and power quietly circulated. To understand this, we must strip away the romantic imagery that later generations have imposed on the era. The sweeping gowns, the chandeliers, the polished manners, these were not signs of leisure or ease. They were signals. Carefully calibrated, constantly monitored signals that communicated class, legitimacy, and submission to an elite code of conduct. Every detail of appearance spoke. Fabric choices, colors, silhouettes, posture, gait, even the angle at which one held their head. All of it was read, interpreted, and judged. In this world, elegance was not decorative. It was functional. The Gilded Age was a time of extreme economic imbalance. Industrial wealth concentrated rapidly in the hands of a small elite, while millions lived in precarious conditions. This imbalance created anxiety among those at the top, an unspoken fear that their authority was fragile, that their dominance required constant reinforcement. Elegance became one of the tools through which that reinforcement occurred. By codifying appearance, the elite transformed wealth into something that appeared natural, inevitable, even moral. Elegance suggested refinement. Refinement implied superiority, and superiority justified control. For those who belonged or aspired to belong to elite society, failing to meet these standards was not a minor social misstep. It was a form of exclusion. Invitations dried up. Doors closed quietly. One was no longer seen, no longer acknowledged, no longer relevant. Social death did not require scandal. It could be triggered simply by wearing the wrong fabric, appearing too relaxed, moving too freely, or displaying emotions that disrupted the illusion of restraint. This is why elegance was enforced not only through fashion, but through the body itself. Posture was disciplined. Children were trained from an early age to sit upright, to move with deliberation, to avoid gestures that suggested urgency or desire. Speed was associated with labor. Stillness was associated with power. To move slowly was to signal that one's time was valuable, that one was not subject to the demands of work or survival. Even walking became an act of class performance. The body was taught to obey before the mind could question. Nowhere was this obligation more severe than for women. Women's bodies became the most visible carriers of elite respectability. Their appearance was not understood as personal, it was communal property, representing the honor, wealth, and discipline of entire families. A woman's elegance reflected directly on her father, her husband, her lineage. As a result, the standards imposed upon her were harsher, more detailed, and less forgiving. Corsets restricted breathing and movement, not accidentally, but intentionally. A body that could not move freely could not act freely. Heavy skirts limited stride length, gloves prevented direct contact, high collars constrained the neck. Every element of women's fashion worked together to create a controlled silhouette, one that discouraged spontaneity, physical strength, and visible autonomy. Elegance demanded discomfort, and discomfort was reframed as virtue. A woman who endured these constraints without complaint was praised as refined, graceful, well-bred. Pain, exhaustion, and restriction were rendered invisible, absorbed into the performance. To acknowledge the cost of elegance was to undermine it. Silence, therefore, became part of the aesthetic. Not speaking of discomfort was itself a marker of class. This silence extended beyond the physical. Emotional restraint was just as critical as bodily control. Women were expected to project calm, pleasant composure at all times. Anger was vulgar. Ambition was unseemly. Curiosity beyond approved boundaries was dangerous. Even joy had to be moderated, carefully expressed within acceptable limits. The elegant woman did not react, she absorbed. She did not demand, she waited. She did not challenge, she endured. In this way, elegance functioned as a behavioral cage. Men, too, were bound by these expectations, though in different ways. Their elegance signaled authority rather than submission, but it was still restrictive. Public displays of emotion were discouraged. Physical labor was hidden. The ideal elite man appeared detached, controlled, unhurried. His composure suggested mastery over himself, over others, over circumstances. Yet this composure was not innate. It was rehearsed, learned, enforced. The difference was consequence. A man might bend the rules and recover. A woman rarely could. What is crucial to understand is that elegance was not enforced through a single institution. There was no official authority policing hems and posture. The enforcement mechanism was social surveillance. Everyone watched everyone else. Approval and disapproval were communicated through glances, invitations, seating arrangements, whispered judgments. Power operated laterally, invisibly, persistently. This made elegance particularly effective as a control system. Because it was unwritten, it could not be challenged directly. Because it was aesthetic, it appeared harmless. And because it was collective, resistance carried high social cost. To refuse elegance was not framed as rebellion, it was framed as failure. The illusion of choice remained intact. One could technically dress differently, move differently, behave differently, but the consequences were understood well enough that most did not try. Constraint masqueraded as preference. Discipline disguised itself as taste. This is how social hierarchies endure without constant force. Elegance also served another purpose. It obscured inequality. By focusing attention on surfaces, on beauty, refinement, decorum, the brutal realities beneath the Gilded Age were softened. Labor exploitation, racial exclusion, gendered confinement, economic violence, all were masked behind polished exteriors. The more beautiful the surface, the less visible the damage beneath it. The elite did not merely enjoy elegance, they needed it. Because elegance transformed power into something that looked deserved. When we look back at photographs from the era, it is tempting to admire the craftsmanship, the detail, the apparent poise. But admiration, when unexamined, risks repeating the illusion. What we are seeing is not ease, it is effort. Not freedom, but compliance. Not harmony, but control rendered beautiful. The true cost of Gilded Age elegance was not paid in silk or lace. It was paid in constrained lives, disciplined bodies, and silenced selves. And perhaps the most enduring legacy of this system is how effective it was. So effective that even now, long after the corsets have loosened and the rules have changed, we still associate elegance with virtue, restraint with worth, silence with dignity. History does not always need chains to control. Sometimes it only needs standards, beautiful ones, enforced quietly. And those standards, once internalized, can outlive the era that created them. Clothing in the Gilded Age was never neutral. It did not simply cover the body, flatter the figure, or follow seasonal trends. It spoke. Quietly, relentlessly, and with consequences. Every layer of fabric, every fastened button, every constrained movement formed a language, one that announced who belonged, who did not, and who was expected to remain silent. To be dressed correctly was to be legible to power. The elaborate gowns of the era were not designed for ease, they were designed for interpretation. Heavy silks, structured bodices, tightly laced corsets, multiple layers of petticoats, these were not aesthetic excesses, they were deliberate signals. They declared that the wearer did not need to run, lift, bend, or work with her hands. They announced distance from labor, from urgency, from physical necessity. In a society obsessed with hierarchy, clothing translated wealth into visibility. The corset is perhaps the most revealing symbol of this system. It shaped the body into an idealized form, but at a cost that was well known and widely ignored. Restricted breathing, fainting spells, internal displacement of organs, these were not side effects, they were accepted consequences. A body that struggled to breathe was a body that could not act impulsively. A body held upright by force was one trained into submission long before it could question why. Corsets did not simply shape waists, they shaped behavior. Movement slowed, gestures became smaller, the body learned restraint. Even sitting required technique, standing required control, walking demanded calculation. Clothing dictated posture, and posture dictated presence. To move freely was to risk appearing common. To appear common was to invite erasure. This is how clothing became a disciplinary tool. Gloves further reinforced this separation. Hands, the primary instruments of labor, were concealed. Skin-to-skin contact was limited, controlled, ritualized. A gloved hand signaled refinement precisely because it signaled distance, from dirt, from work, from touch. It created a barrier not only between the body and the world, but between people themselves. Intimacy was filtered through fabric. Power was preserved through separation. Hats functioned in a similar way. Large, structured, often impractical, they required careful balance and deliberate movement. One could not rush while wearing them. One could not move carelessly. The hat enforced a certain pace, a certain stillness. It framed the face, shadowed the eyes, and limited visibility. In doing so, it trained the wearer to be seen without seeing too much, to exist as an object of observation rather than an active observer. Men's clothing carried its own messages. Tailored suits, stiff collars, and long coats restricted the neck and upper body, discouraging overt physical expression. The polished appearance suggested control, rationality, authority. Like women's attire, men's fashion communicated distance from manual labor. Clean lines and delicate fabrics implied that the body underneath was protected from strain, from exposure, from necessity. In both cases, clothing did not reflect identity, it produced it. What made this system especially powerful was its subtlety. There was no single authority dictating these rules. No law required women to lace their corsets tightly, or men to wear restrictive collars, yet deviation was punished swiftly and efficiently through social mechanisms. A woman dressed too simply risked being labeled careless or improper. One dressed too boldly risked being judged vulgar. Men who appeared too relaxed risked seeming unserious, untrustworthy, or weak. The boundaries were narrow, and everyone knew them. This is what made clothing such an effective language of power. It relied on internalized discipline. Individuals monitored themselves. Families monitored each other. Society at large enforced conformity through glances, gossip, invitations withheld, reputations quietly damaged. Compliance felt voluntary because resistance carried costs that were never spoken aloud. For women, these costs were especially high. A woman's clothing was treated as a moral statement. Modesty, restraint, and complexity were equated with virtue. Simplicity or comfort was often read as moral failure. Her body became a surface onto which expectations were projected. The more constrained her appearance, the more respectable she was considered. Freedom of movement was not admired, it was feared. The paradox was cruel and precise. The more a woman's body disappeared beneath layers of fabric, the more socially visible she became. Elegance required effort, time, and money. It required assistance, maids to dress, to lace, to fasten, to arrange. This dependence was not incidental. It reinforced class hierarchies even within the household. The woman who wore the gown demonstrated her status through the invisible labor of others. Her stillness was made possible by someone else's work. Thus, clothing did not only separate classes in public, it organized power in private. What is often overlooked is how deeply this system shaped women's inner lives. Wearing restrictive clothing day after day trained the body to accept discomfort as normal. Pain became background noise. Fatigue became unremarkable. Over time, the body learned not to protest, and when the body stops protesting, the mind often follows. This is not metaphorical. Physical constraint affects psychological experience. Restricted breathing alters emotional regulation. Limited movement reduces the impulse to act. The constant requirement to maintain composure under discomfort fosters emotional suppression. In this way, clothing became a tool not only of social control, but of internal control. Silence was stitched into the seams. Women were praised for enduring these constraints gracefully. Complaining was seen as weakness. Adjusting one's clothing in public was improper. A woman who appeared unaffected by discomfort was admired. The performance of ease mattered more than actual comfort. This performance, repeated endlessly, created the illusion that the system worked, that elegance was natural, that restraint was effortless. It was neither. The language of clothing also extended across racial and cultural lines, enforcing exclusion as much as hierarchy. Those who could not afford or were not permitted to wear elite styles were immediately marked as outsiders. Their bodies were read differently, controlled differently. Clothing made inequality visible, while allowing those at the top to claim refinement rather than dominance. And perhaps most insidious of all was how this system disguised coercion as choice. Fashion magazines, etiquette guides, and social commentary framed these standards as desirable. Women were told that elegance elevated them, that restraint made them admirable, that discipline was empowering. The idea that one might choose discomfort for social approval was normalized. Over time, the distinction between desire and obligation blurred. This is how power becomes invisible. When clothing functions as a language, it teaches its speakers to forget they are speaking it. The rules feel natural. The penalties feel deserved. Those who succeed within the system are praised for their taste rather than their compliance. Those who fail are blamed for their inadequacy rather than the constraints imposed upon them. Looking back, it is tempting to romanticize the aesthetic achievements of the Gilded Age. The craftsmanship was real, the artistry was undeniable. But beauty does not negate function, and function in this case was control. The elegance of the era was not worn lightly. It was worn deliberately, repeatedly, and with purpose. It marked bodies, regulated behavior, and enforced silence. It taught women to shrink without disappearing, to endure without resisting, to exist within narrow boundaries while appearing admired. This is why clothing mattered so much. It was not simply what people wore, it was how power taught itself to be seen, without ever needing to speak. And yet, what made this language of clothing truly enduring was not its visibility, but its ability to follow women even when no one was watching. Long after the mirrors were left behind, long after the gowns were removed at the end of the day, the discipline remained. The body remembered. The spine stayed upright. The breath stayed shallow. The movements stayed measured. Clothing trained the body the way repetition trains the mind. Over time, constraint no longer felt imposed. It felt correct. This is how power settles into muscle memory. Women learned to anticipate judgment before it arrived. They adjusted their posture before anyone corrected them. They moderated their gestures before anyone disapproved. The rules no longer needed to be enforced from the outside because they had been absorbed from within. Clothing had done its work, and the reward for this internalization was conditional acceptance. A woman who mastered this language of elegance could move within elite spaces, but never freely. She could be seen, but only in approved ways. She could influence, but only indirectly. Her clothing signaled discipline, and discipline earned proximity to power, but not ownership of it. Elegance granted access, not authority. This distinction mattered, because while men's tailored suits suggested command, women's elaborate attire suggested containment. Both were symbols of class, but only one was permitted to act openly. Women were expected to embody the ideals of the system without disrupting it. Their appearance reassured society that order was intact. Even rebellion had limits. Small deviations, slightly looser lacing, softer fabrics, simpler designs, were often framed as fashion trends rather than resistance. The system adapted, absorbing change without surrendering control. True rejection of the language carried consequences too severe for most to risk. To dress for comfort, speed, or practicality was to step outside the narrative of refinement entirely. And outside that narrative, there was no protection. What is often forgotten is how exhausting this performance was. Elegance demanded constant awareness. One could never fully relax. The body was always on display, always evaluated, always compared. Clothing magnified this scrutiny by making the body both visible and inaccessible, admired but not allowed to exist naturally. This produced a particular kind of fatigue, one that did not announce itself loudly. It settled quietly into the nervous system. Many women of the era described vague illnesses, chronic weakness, unexplained anxiety. These were often dismissed as feminine fragility, rather than recognized as the psychological cost of living inside a controlled body. The system blamed the body for reacting to the cage, and still, the language persisted because it worked. It created order in a rapidly changing world. It reassured the elite that their status was visible and secure. It taught women how to survive within narrow margins, and it made power look graceful rather than coercive. Perhaps the most striking aspect of this language is how familiar it still feels. Modern women no longer wear corsets or floor-length gowns as daily uniform, yet the expectation remains: to look polished, composed, controlled. Discomfort is still reframed as effort. Silence is still praised as grace. The idea that appearance reflects moral worth has not disappeared. It has only changed its costume. This is the legacy of the Gilded Age's unspoken law. Clothing taught women how to take up less space without vanishing. It taught them how to endure scrutiny without protest. It taught them that being seen was safer than being heard. These lessons did not end with the era. They were passed down, refined, modernized. Because once power learns how to speak through beauty, it rarely returns to force. The elegance of the Gilded Age was not fragile, it was engineered. And its language, quiet, persuasive, embodied, proved strong enough to survive long after the chandeliers dimmed and the silk faded. What remains is the discipline it left behind, still echoing in the way women are taught to move through the world. Not loudly, not freely, but beautifully and in silence. For women of the upper class, elegance was never a shared burden. It settled on them most heavily, most visibly, and most relentlessly. While men were expected to perform refinement in public, women were required to embody it at all times. Their bodies, their voices, their emotions, and even their ambitions became instruments through which social order was displayed and preserved. Elegance, for these women, was not an accessory. It was a condition of existence. From an early age, girls born into elite families were trained not toward freedom, but toward containment. Their education emphasized posture before intellect, composure before curiosity, obedience before expression. They learned how to sit without fidgeting, how to stand without leaning, how to walk without haste. These lessons were not presented as restrictions, but as preparation. Preparation for a life in which they would be watched, assessed, and judged as representatives of something larger than themselves. The body was the first site of discipline. To move too much was to appear restless. Restlessness suggested impatience, and impatience suggested desire. Desire, in an elite woman, was considered dangerous. A woman who moved slowly, carefully, and sparingly signaled control over her body and, by extension, over her impulses. This is why so much effort was invested in limiting movement. Clothing, posture, and etiquette all worked together to produce stillness. Stillness was read as virtue. Speech was governed by similar rules. Women were encouraged to speak softly, briefly, and pleasantly. Wit was acceptable, but only in measured doses. Intelligence was admired, but only when it did not challenge authority or draw too much attention. Opinions were safest when expressed indirectly, softened by politeness, or delivered through others. Silence was not emptiness, it was strategy, imposed as expectation. An outspoken woman risked being labeled improper, aggressive, or unrefined. A silent woman was praised as graceful. Emotional restraint followed naturally. Displays of anger, frustration, or ambition disrupted the illusion of harmony that elite society worked so hard to maintain. Women were expected to absorb discomfort without visible reaction. To endure with a calm expression was considered a mark of breeding. Pain, whether physical or emotional, was to be hidden behind a composed exterior. This expectation did not mean women felt less. It meant they were trained not to show it. Ambition, in particular, was carefully policed. Upper-class women were not forbidden from influencing the world, but they were forbidden from appearing to want power for themselves. Open ambition suggested hunger, and hunger suggested lack. A woman who appeared to want something too strongly risked revealing dependence, vulnerability, or desire, traits incompatible with the image of serene refinement. Therefore, ambition had to be disguised. It was allowed only when reframed as duty, duty to family, to husband, to children, to society. Women could organize, manage, influence, and direct, but only under the cover of respectability. Their achievements were expected to appear effortless, incidental, even accidental. Success that looked intentional was suspect. This is how women became symbols rather than subjects. An upper-class woman's primary role was not self-realization, but representation. She represented her family's wealth, stability, and moral standing. Her appearance signaled prosperity. Her behavior signaled discipline. Her silence signaled control. Any deviation threatened not just her reputation, but the standing of those connected to her. The pressure was constant because the stakes were collective. Marriage intensified these expectations. A wife's elegance reflected directly on her husband's status. Her ability to host flawlessly, to appear composed under scrutiny, to maintain social networks without scandal, all of this supported male authority without ever challenging it. She became the polished surface through which power appeared respectable. And yet, within this confinement, some women wielded remarkable influence. Figures like Caroline Astor exemplify this paradox. She held enormous social power, deciding who was admitted into elite circles, whose names carried legitimacy, whose families mattered. Her authority shaped the social landscape of New York's high society, and yet she exercised this power through restraint. Publicly, she appeared calm, dignified, almost passive. She did not command loudly. She did not assert openly. Her influence flowed through invitation lists, seating arrangements, silences, and exclusions. Power, in her hands, was invisible by design. This invisibility was not accidental. It was necessary. For a woman to wield overt authority would have disrupted the gendered order of the time. Influence was permitted only when it could be mistaken for social grace. Decision-making was allowed only when it could be framed as etiquette. Control was acceptable only when it appeared maternal, benevolent, or inevitable. Women learned to operate in shadows not because they preferred darkness, but because light was forbidden. The cost of this system was profound. Living as a symbol required constant self-monitoring. Every word, every gesture, every expression was filtered through expectation. The self became something to manage rather than inhabit. Over time, this produced a form of internal fragmentation. There was the woman as she appeared, and the woman as she felt, and the distance between the two was rarely acknowledged. Acknowledging it would have required breaking the performance. Many women internalized these expectations so deeply that they mistook discipline for identity. They came to believe that restraint was who they were, rather than what was demanded of them. This internalization made resistance difficult, because it no longer felt like resistance to an external system. It felt like betrayal of oneself. This is one of the most effective forms of control. The elegance imposed on women was praised as elevation. In reality, it was limitation refined into an ideal. By associating worth with restraint, society ensured that women policed themselves. By equating silence with dignity, it ensured that dissatisfaction remained unspoken. By framing ambition as unbecoming, it ensured that power remained safely indirect. And yet, despite these constraints, women endured. They adapted. They found ways to exert influence within narrow corridors. But adaptation should not be mistaken for freedom. What is often missing from nostalgic portrayals of the Gilded Age is the recognition that elegance required sacrifice. It required women to compress their inner lives to fit an external mold. It required them to prioritize appearance over comfort, harmony over honesty, acceptance over authenticity. The system did not ask whether this was sustainable, it only asked whether it was effective. And it was. So effective that its logic still echoes today. Women are still praised for composure, criticized for visible ambition, encouraged to soften their voices, temper their emotions, and make power palatable. The language has changed, but the expectations remain familiar. The Gilded Age did not invent these dynamics, but it perfected them. Elegance became the means by which women were elevated and constrained simultaneously. They were placed on pedestals not to be admired freely, but to remain fixed, unmoving, and silent. Their value lay not in who they were, but in what they represented. In the end, the greatest burden of elegance was not the weight of fabric or the discipline of posture. It was the erasure of the self beneath the performance. And that erasure, once normalized, became one of the most enduring legacies of power history chose not to name. Elegance in the Gilded Age was never an honest reflection of stability. It was a surface, carefully maintained, obsessively polished, designed to hide how close the society beneath it was to fracture. The more refined the exterior appeared, the more violent the reality it was meant to conceal. This was an era defined by contradiction. Extraordinary wealth existed alongside crushing poverty, often within the same city, sometimes within the same street. Industrial fortunes were amassed at a speed never seen before, while workers labored for exhausting hours in unsafe conditions, earning barely enough to survive. Children worked, women worked. Bodies were consumed by factories, mines, and railroads. And yet, the public image of the age was one of grace, manners, and beauty. That contrast was not accidental. It was essential. Elegance functioned as a social anesthetic. It softened the sight of inequality, dulled moral outrage, and transformed exploitation into something distant, almost abstract. When society wrapped itself in silk, it became harder to see the blood beneath. The extreme wealth gap of the Gilded Age created an uncomfortable truth. Prosperity for the few depended directly on suffering for the many. This was not ignorance. The elite knew where their wealth came from. They knew about the long shifts, the injuries, the hunger. But acknowledging this openly would have threatened the legitimacy of their power. Elegance offered an escape from that acknowledgement. When the upper classes appeared refined, calm, and orderly, the system that sustained them could be framed as equally refined, calm, and orderly. Beauty replaced justice as the visible measure of success. Grand homes, immaculate clothing, formal dinners, and rigid etiquette created the impression of civilization triumphing over chaos. They suggested that wealth was not seized, but deserved. That authority was not imposed, but earned. That inequality was not violent, but natural. Elegance did not deny injustice. It distracted from it. Public life became a stage where harmony was performed, even as private reality told a different story. Balls glittered, while tenements overflowed. Charity galas coexisted with child labor. Society columns celebrated fashion and marriages, while strikes were broken and workers were silenced. The surface narrative was one of progress and sophistication. The underlying reality was tension, resentment, and fear. This fear mattered. The elite were deeply aware that their position was unstable. Rapid industrialization had created wealth faster than it had created social legitimacy. Old aristocratic structures had weakened, and new money lacked historical grounding. Elegance helped fill that gap. It gave wealth a cultural script, a way to look established even when it was new. Refinement became proof of belonging. At the same time, elegance worked downward, shaping how inequality was perceived by those who suffered under it. When power presents itself as beautiful, resistance becomes harder. Anger feels impolite. Rage feels out of place. Complaints sound crude against a backdrop of polished manners. The aesthetic of elegance subtly reframed injustice as something unfortunate but inevitable. This reframing was especially effective with women. Women, as the most visible carriers of elegance, became part of the masking process. Their composed appearances, their quiet demeanor, their carefully managed social rituals projected an image of stability. They hosted dinners, organized charity events, and upheld the illusion that society was coherent and benevolent. Their labor, emotional, social, and often invisible, helped smooth over contradictions the system could not resolve. Charity itself became a performance of elegance. Philanthropy during the Gilded Age was often public, formal, and highly aestheticized. Donations were announced, events were photographed, benefactors were praised. This created the impression that inequality was being addressed, even as its structural causes remained untouched. Elegance allowed generosity to coexist with exploitation without forcing a reckoning between the two. Economic violence was transformed into a moral narrative. Those at the bottom were framed as unfortunate, not wronged. Poverty was presented as a personal tragedy rather than a systemic outcome. And because elegance emphasized composure and restraint, visible suffering was discouraged. Pain that remained unseen was pain that did not demand change. This was not merely social blindness, it was social design. The Gilded Age also faced profound moral and cultural anxiety. Traditional values were destabilized by rapid urbanization, immigration, and technological change. Old certainties were eroding. Elegance stepped in as a stabilizing symbol. It promised order in a world that felt increasingly unmanageable. Rigid etiquette rules provided predictability. Fashion standards offered clarity. Social hierarchies, though cruel, felt structured. In a time of upheaval, elegance reassured people that someone was in control, even if that control was illusory. And crucially, elegance made control look gentle. Power, when wrapped in politeness, appears less threatening. Decisions made behind closed doors seem less violent when announced at a formal dinner. Exclusion feels less brutal when executed through invitations not sent, rather than doors slammed shut. Elegance transformed domination into decorum. This transformation mattered most when unrest surfaced. Labor strikes, protests, and social movements were often portrayed as disruptive, ugly, and dangerous, visually and morally contrasted with the calm refinement of elite society. Elegance became a visual argument against dissent. It implied that those who challenged the system were uncivilized, excessive, and emotionally uncontrolled. In this way, beauty became political. The more unrest grew, the more aggressively elegance was performed. Extravagant architecture, increasingly elaborate fashion, and intensified social rituals all worked to assert dominance symbolically when it was threatened materially. The surface had to shine brighter as the cracks underneath widened. For women listening today, this dynamic may feel unsettlingly familiar. The expectation that pain should be hidden, that injustice should be endured quietly, that anger should be softened into something palatable. These are not relics of the past. They are echoes. The Gilded Age did not invent the idea that beauty can excuse harm, but it demonstrated how effectively that idea can be deployed. Elegance did not solve the problems of the era. It delayed confrontation with them. It created a buffer between cause and consequence, between suffering and responsibility. It allowed society to admire itself while avoiding accountability. And perhaps that is why the image of the Gilded Age remains so seductive. We remember the beauty because it was designed to be remembered. We forget the instability because it was designed to be forgotten. Elegance functioned as historical misdirection, guiding attention away from the violence that made it possible. But when we look closely, when we refuse to be distracted by the polish, we see that elegance was not the opposite of brutality. It was its accomplice. It did not end inequality. It made inequality tolerable to those who benefited from it. And that, more than any gown or chandelier, was its most dangerous achievement. Silence in the Gilded Age was not emptiness. It was not absence, weakness, or submission in the way history often frames it. Silence was cultivated, practiced, and rewarded. It was shaped carefully until it became one of the most reliable tools power had ever learned to use. The greatest elegance of the era was not stitched into gowns or polished into manners. It was trained into the voice, specifically into when not to use it. In a society obsessed with order, silence functioned as proof of control. To remain quiet under pressure signaled discipline. To absorb discomfort without protest suggested superiority. To refrain from speaking when one could have was interpreted not as fear, but as refinement. The ability to stay silent was read as evidence that one belonged among those who did not need to explain themselves. Power spoke least. Those at the top did not raise their voices because they did not need to. Their authority was assumed, reinforced by structures that did the speaking for them. Wealth, reputation, tradition, social consensus. Silence, in this context, was not passivity. It was insulation. It protected power from scrutiny, from challenge, from the instability that open debate might introduce. For women, this silence was both imposed and internalized. From an early age, women learned that speaking too much was dangerous. Words could reveal dissatisfaction. They could expose ambition. They could hint at awareness. Awareness itself was threatening. Silence, by contrast, was safe. It preserved harmony. It reassured those in power that nothing was wrong, or at least that nothing would be said about it. A woman who did not complain was praised. A woman who did not argue was admired. A woman who did not demand was trusted. Silence became a form of social currency. What made this system especially effective was that silence was framed as choice rather than coercion. Women were told they were dignified, graceful, well-bred. They were encouraged to see restraint as character rather than conditioning. Over time, many came to believe that quietness was who they were, not what they had been trained to perform. This is how silence stops feeling like suppression and starts feeling like identity. Silence also worked collectively. When many people remain quiet, isolation deepens. Each individual assumes they are alone in their discomfort, their doubt, their dissatisfaction. Without shared language, shared anger, shared naming of harm, resistance cannot easily form. Silence fragments solidarity before it can begin. The Gilded Age depended on this fragmentation. Economic exploitation, gendered confinement, and social injustice all relied on the fact that grievances were rarely spoken aloud in the same spaces where power resided. Silence ensured that injustice remained private, personal, and therefore manageable. A problem unspoken is a problem unthreatening. And yet, silence was never evenly distributed. Those with the least power were expected to be the quietest. Those with the most power benefited most from that quiet. This imbalance was not accidental, it was the design. When the vulnerable are silent, the system appears stable. When the powerful are silent, the system appears natural. The most dangerous silence, however, was emotional. Women were trained not only to withhold words, but to conceal feeling. Anger was softened into politeness. Grief was made discreet. Frustration was redirected inward. Emotional expression was treated as a loss of control, and control was the ultimate virtue. This emotional silence protected the system in a subtle way. If women did not outwardly suffer, then suffering could be denied. If no one appeared angry, then nothing appeared wrong. The absence of visible distress became evidence that the system was working. Pain that leaves no trace makes no demands. Silence also allowed power to shift responsibility. When injustice went unnamed, it could be dismissed as misunderstanding, coincidence, or personal failing. Without words, there was no accusation. Without accusation, there was no accountability. Silence absolved those who benefited from harm by ensuring that harm remained diffuse and deniable. This is why silence was taught so carefully. Etiquette manuals, social expectations, and moral codes all reinforced the same lesson. Do not make scenes. Do not draw attention. Do not disrupt. These were framed as virtues, but they functioned as barriers. They prevented discomfort from reaching the surface, where it might have forced change. The result was a society that looked calm while carrying immense internal tension. Women, especially, became experts at managing this tension. They learned to hold contradictions inside themselves without external release, to host graciously while feeling trapped, to smile while being constrained, to maintain composure while absorbing loss. This endurance was praised, but it was never neutral. Endurance benefited those who did not have to endure. And yet, silence was not only imposed from above, it was also embraced as survival. In a system that punished visibility, quietness became a strategy. Not speaking could protect one's reputation, one's family, one's access. Silence was sometimes the only form of control available. This complexity matters. To recognize silence as power is not to romanticize it, but to understand its function. Silence protected the system because it was useful. It allowed power to operate without friction. It allowed injustice to persist without interruption. It allowed domination to appear orderly rather than violent. The tragedy is that this trained silence did not disappear when the era ended. Its echoes remain in how women are still praised for composure, still discouraged from expressing anger, still expected to make discomfort invisible. The vocabulary has changed, but the expectation has not. Calm is still rewarded. Assertiveness is still penalized. Silence is still misread as strength. The Gilded Age taught society that power does not always need force. Sometimes it only needs quiet. And when silence becomes habitual, it no longer feels like something imposed. It feels like the way things are. The most effective systems of control are the ones that no longer announce themselves. They simply wait for everyone to remain quiet. That was the true elegance of the Gilded Age, not beauty, not refinement, but the ability to make silence look like grace. And as long as silence is mistaken for dignity, power will continue to protect itself without ever having to speak. And this is where history often chooses to stop speaking, not because nothing more happened, but because silence worked exactly as it was meant to. The Gilded Age did not collapse under the weight of its elegance. It endured because elegance made inequality tolerable, made restraint admirable, and made silence look like virtue. What was never said mattered more than what was recorded. What was endured quietly shaped lives more deeply than what was debated publicly. This story is not about nostalgia. It is not about fashion, and it is not about admiration. It is about how power learned to survive without violence, by training bodies, emotions, and voices to disappear in plain sight. History did not forget these women. History learned from them. It learned that control does not need chains when it has standards. It learned that obedience does not need commands when it is wrapped in beauty. And it learned that the most effective silence is the one people mistake for dignity. If this story made you pause, even briefly, ask yourself why. And if you are watching this late at night or early in the morning, From somewhere quiet or crowded, let us know where you are and what time it is for you right now. These stories are shaped by those who listen to them. Thank you for staying with Veiled Queens, a channel that does not invent drama, does not romanticize the past, and does not add what history never allowed to be spoken. We examine what was real, what was enforced, and what was deliberately left unsaid. Because sometimes the most powerful part of history is not what it tells us, but what it trained us never to say. Until next time, this is Veiled Queens.